All right, good morning. If you have your Bibles, if you want to open up to Genesis chapter 7, we will get there soon. We just want to share a little story to start. In 1983, Australia held the first Westfield Sydney to Melbourne ultra marathon. I don't know have you ever heard of an ultra marathon? 875 kilometers, 544 miles between these two cities. I did the math. That's a little more than 21 marathons stacked on top of each other. This was considered to be one of the toughest ultra marathons in the entire world, and elite athletes came for everywhere to participate. And it typically took 5 to 7 days to complete this race. Now, there was a man named Cliff Young, a potato farmer from rural Victoria, 61 years old. He showed up at the race wearing overalls and work boots. Not the typical outfit for a professional marathon runner. He told reporters that he grew up chasing sheep, herding sheep on foot, sometimes walking and running 2 and 3 days straight around their 2,000-acre farm. Herding sheep on feet, that's something. He believed that gave him endurance, and it probably did. So the strategy for this race, the professional runners had a strategy. They would run for 18 hours, sleep for 6, and then they would do it again. And they would do this for like a week. Cliff didn't quite know how it was supposed to work. He didn't realize you were supposed to sleep, so he just shuffled. He didn't run. He had this shuffle he would do. He shuffled day and night without stopping. Apparently, his shuffle was very energy efficient. Okay, so to the world's shock, he not only finished the race, he won it. And it's crazy. He beat the record by 2 days. So Cliff, who's a potato farmer, in overalls and work boots, beat professional runners from around the world. His experience chasing sheep on the farm gave him endurance to beat professional runners from everywhere. That is incredible. So we've been in this series, Unshakable. We've been talking about faith. How do we live a life that is unshakable? How do we have that kind of faith? Just want to start here in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. So the writer of Hebrews, he's comparing this life of faith to a race. And I think it would be safe to say that this life is a lot more like a marathon than it is a sprint. And if you compete in a marathon, how do you finish? You just keep on running. And if you're in an ultra marathon, you just keep on running even when it gets really, really difficult. Being unshakable is not just about having faith for the quick win. I love it when we pray for healing and we see immediate results, but you know what? That does not always happen. Being unshakable is about having a faith that endures when the answer seems to take a lot longer than we expect and when things don't go the way we thought they should. So endurance is a determination to keep going despite the way that things look. James wrote this in chapter 1, this is verses 2 through 4. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. Isn't that our perspective? Yes, another trouble. Okay, for you know, when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. So the difficulties of this life, troubles of any kind, are actually an opportunity for us to grow. And this is so not my typical perspective. Typically, I think all of us, we strive to avoid difficulties. You know, we want a life of ease, right? I don't think it's just me, but I think that's kind of like the American way. Now, this doesn't mean we go out looking for difficulties. Sometimes we actually create our own trials through our disobedience. But even when we are doing our best, when we're being obedient, we are going to face trials and we are going to need endurance. So James, he said that endurance enables your faith to develop so you will be perfect and complete. Endurance is what enables you to become mature in your faith. If you remember, we've used this equation. Faith equals hope times action. Or we could say it like this. Faith equals anticipant expectation times obedience. If you don't have any obedience, doesn't matter how much anticipation you have, anything times zero is what? Zero. Maturing in faith looks like maturing in our hope and maturing in our willingness to actually take steps to act on that hope. And so as we're considering endurance today, I want us to take a look at the life of Joseph. We talked about Abraham a few weeks ago. If you remember him, God had called Abraham to leave his home and go to the land that he was going to show him later. God, he made promises to Abraham. He promised to make him a great nation. He promised to give him the land of Canaan, and he promised to make him a blessing to the entire world. Joseph was Abraham's great-grandson. Joseph, he had 11 brothers, and all of them lived together with their father, Jacob, in Canaan. And the promises that God had made to Abraham are passed down. You know, they were for Jacob, they were for his family, and there was a prophetic, you could say there was a prophetic destiny and blessing on this family. And so I want to pick up in Genesis chapter 37 with verse number 2. We're going to read through verse 11. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. When Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing, maybe not all of them, that didn't go over well. I lost my spot. He reported some bad things. Okay, he tattletaled. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children. Why? Because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, let me get a drink of water. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him even more. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. His brothers responded, So you think you'll become our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again, he told his brothers about it. Listen, I've had another dream, he said. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me. This time he told the dream to his father as well as his brothers, but his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that, he asked. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow before you? If you have an iPad, don't just randomly put your finger on it because it changes the page. While Joseph's brothers were jealous, his father wondered what the dreams meant. Okay, so we can see a few things about Joseph here. Unlike his brothers, he is loyal and obedient to his father. He was especially loved by his father, but his brothers hated him. And though we see that there's this blessing of Abraham on Jacob's family, it seems like Joseph is the only one that God is speaking to, or perhaps he is the only one who's paying attention. Now, when God speaks through a prophetic word or a dream, what God is speaking contains the power to bring it about. Kind of like an acorn. And I have some props. We have acorns all over our yard right now. And if you look at them, they're all different sizes. But you know what's really special about these acorns? What is it? Yeah, it grows into a tree, right? Okay. Now, considered, enough time and the right conditions, yes, it will grow into a tree. If our dog gets a hold of it and chews it up, it's not going to be a tree. Given the right conditions, it will be a tree. Now, the first step in growth for an acorn is not the most glamorous. The first step is being planted in the dirt. That acorn isn't reaching for the sky. The very first step is not going up, it's actually going down. Now, after a while, this little thing is going to begin to sprout. Eventually, it's going to form some leaves. And then what's going to happen? The leaves are going to fall off, and it's going to get covered by snow. That acorn is not going to become a tree overnight, is it? It's not even going to become a tree in a year. It's going to take a lot of slow growth, a lot of exposure to the sun, to the cold, to the wind, the rain. A prophetic promise is similar. We have to grow. We get an acorn, we don't get an oak tree, right? Okay, so what became of Joseph's dream? So one day Joseph is sent by his father to go check on his brothers who are watching sheep. And we know that hasn't always gone well in the past. He'll tell what they're doing. And so when the brothers see Joseph coming in the distance, they made a plan. This is what they said in Genesis 37, verse 20. He said, "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, which is like a well. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." So his brothers had pretty much no value for him whatsoever. Judah had some value for him. He said, "Well, why don't we do this? Let's get some money for him. That's better than killing him." And so what they did is they took Joseph and they sold him to a group of traders who were on their way to Egypt. Can you imagine? I don't know, have you ever been in a situation where you felt like someone pulled the rug out from under you? Like there is absolutely no more hope because of your change of circumstances. You've got to think that's how Joseph may have felt. And just thinking about that, would you be tempted to give up at that point? See, hope is an essential part of faith. We said faith is hope times action. So what would you do if you were in Joseph's situation? Like if you look at him, his world, if you want to talk about being shaken, his world was shaken. After his brothers sold him to the traders, Joseph, he was taken to Egypt. He was then sold as a slave to Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's officials. So we're going to pick up here in Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. And this pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All of his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and his livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about anything except what kind of food to eat. Okay, so we see Joseph, horrible situation. He sold as a slave, and I'm sure, think about that. That's got to be incredibly discouraging, incredibly traumatic. And what we notice about Joseph is he didn't shut down. He actually got to work. He served and he made his master successful. You see, Joseph, he endured, and God blessed Joseph and Potiphar. God gave Joseph success in everything that he did, and he blessed Potiphar's house because of Joseph. And so Potiphar, he just gives Joseph complete authority over all of his affairs. Now, if you notice what Joseph is doing here, this doesn't look anything like his dreams, does it? Joseph is not a king. He's actually serving as a slave in his Egyptian master's home. Joseph served where he was, and God blessed him for it. Now, you could look at Joseph and say, well, he's a survivor. He is simply trying to make the best of a bad situation. Like, as a survivor, he will do anything it takes just to survive. So let's see what happens. Before long, Potiphar's wife actually took notice of Joseph, and she tried to get him to go to bed with her. But Joseph refused. This is Genesis 39, verse 8. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. So if we look at Joseph, okay, he's not a survivor. He's not willing to do anything. Rather, Joseph, he remained obedient to God, and he was actually loyal to his master. He didn't try to take advantage of his situation. He stood up for what he knew was right. He refused to go to bed with his master's wife. Now, when the other servants were gone, she grabbed his robe and she demanded, come to bed with me. And Joseph, I guess he did the only thing he knew what to do. He just ran, and she just held onto his robe. So he ran off without anything on. And so when she saw what happened, she called the other servants in, and she said, look, he came in here to take advantage of me, and I screamed, and he took off. And she told her husband, and of course he was furious, and he had Joseph put in prison. So if we look at his situation, things are going from pretty bad to a lot worse. Was Joseph tempted to question God, do you think, at this point? Maybe ask him, where are you? Why are you letting this happen to me? Is there any point in being obedient? Because he's doing the right things, and things are actually getting worse. You might think about his life kind of like one of these little acorns. Imagine this thing is sprouted, it sends up this little shoot, and then a foot of snow falls on top of it. What's the acorn thinking? I'm never going to be a tree. I'm worse off than I was, before. So Potiphar was furious. Picking up here in Genesis 39, verse 19. Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison, and he showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. So what do we see Joseph doing here? Well, he's just serving in whatever role he's given. We don't see him lamenting and crying over what he doesn't have. He's simply stewarding whatever he does have. So he served Potiphar, and now he's serving in position. Serving in prison. And in that position, God, he gave Joseph favor. Joseph, he did such a good job. He served with so much excellence that Potiphar first put Joseph in charge of everything, and now we see the prison warden doing the same thing, just putting him in charge of everything. So again, we've got to ask the question, so is Joseph fulfilling that prophetic dream? Is that coming to pass? Is he a king? Well, no, it's kind of the opposite. He's actually serving. But what we see is that he's literally stewarding every opportunity that comes to him, and God is blessing him everywhere he serves. So he's kind of like that little acorn that just keeps growing. He's like that athlete that just keeps running. Although if you look at it, it looks like he's running in the wrong race entirely. But he just keeps going. He just keeps running. Now, in prison, Joseph, he meets two of Pharaoh's officials. and they had both upset Pharaoh somehow, so they found themselves in prison. And one day, each of these officials, they have a dream, and there's no one there to interpret their dreams. And so Joseph says, well, tell me your dream. And he interprets the dreams. And according to the dreams, the baker was executed. What happened in his dream, what Joseph interpreted, came true. And the cupbearer for the king was restored to his position, just like Joseph interpreted his dream. Now, Joseph had hoped when the cupbearer returned to the king that this man would remember Joseph, put in a good word for him. Unfortunately, he completely forgot Joseph, and Joseph just remained in prison. Again, how would you be doing if you were in Joseph's situation? At this point, would you be ready to give up? Like, I'm serving, I'm doing the best I can, but, things are just not going Joseph's way. He actually remains in prison 2 more years until Pharaoh himself has 2 dreams. Nobody can interpret them until the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And so Joseph is brought from the prison. They give him a bath. They shave him. They put on new clothes. And he's taken before Pharaoh. And Joseph is able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And through that, he is actually given responsibility for the entire nation of Egypt. What a bizarre day. He wakes up a prisoner, and he goes to bed that night as the leader of the most powerful nation on earth at that time. So Pharaoh has given Joseph authority over all of Egypt. It sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? That happened in Potiphar's house, that happened in the prison. And I know I'm cutting out a lot. If you want to read the story, please go back and read it later. It's just too much to review right now. But Joseph, he gets to work, and he starts storing grain for the 7 years of plenty. He's preparing for the 7 years of famine. And of course, the famine comes, just like Pharaoh dreamed. And what happened? Well, Joseph's family, they're not far away. They're experiencing the famine, and his brothers actually came to Egypt to buy grain, and they didn't recognize Joseph. They couldn't see him for who he was. Now think about this. He is, like, this is the thing of movies. He is in the perfect place to get revenge, isn't he? His brothers don't recognize him. He is pretty much the most powerful man on earth right now. He could do whatever he wanted to his brothers. He could so get even with them for what they did to him. But what happened? I'll tell you as soon as I find my spot. I know up here, but if I just start talking, I will go the wrong direction. And here it is. He forgave them. What did he do? He forgave them. He brought his whole family to Egypt so that he could provide for them during the famine. So literally, his dream had come to pass. His whole family came. They bowed before him. You see, God had actually elevated Joseph to a position from which he was able to rescue his family. So what I want to look at is, okay, how did Joseph endure? How did he do it? How did he persevere when it seemed like everything was against him for so long? And you might even wonder, like, how is it this kid who's a shepherd, who then becomes a slave, who then becomes a prisoner, how is it that he is put in charge of the most powerful nation on earth? So I want to look at several keys here to endurance. The first key, I think, is forgiveness. When we look at Joseph, was he bitter and full of resentment towards his brothers? I mean, he sure should have been, huh? I mean, they were awful. They sold him into slavery. Now, they wanted to kill him, but then they thought, well, we can get something for him. They had no regard for him whatsoever. But do we see that Joseph became bitter towards them? You know, did he even become bitter towards God? Like, how could he let this happen to me? Like, look at my circumstances. No, he didn't. He had a lot of reasons to become bitter. His brothers, Potiphar's wife even, He could have even become bitter at God, thinking, why did you let this happen to me? Now, he could have gotten revenge, but he forgave. Now, it's interesting when his father died, after his whole family's in Egypt years later, Joseph's father, Jacob, he dies. And Joseph's brothers came to him because they're afraid, okay, now that our dad's out of the way, maybe he's going to get his revenge. And so they come to him, but how did Joseph respond? In Genesis 50:20, we see Joseph, he says, you intended to harm me, right? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. You see, Joseph, he forgave, and this, I believe, is what enabled him to continue. He forgave, which prevented him from being stuck in bitterness. Because he forgave, he did not shut down. He was able to keep going. And because he was willing to forgive, I believe he was able to recognize how God took a terrible situation and used it for good. Now, if you think about this little acorn a little bit, it gets planted in the ground. What if, this acorn has the thought like, how dare they put me under the earth? I'm supposed to grow into this beautiful tree. What if this little acorn becomes bitter and it just shut down? It just gives up on life and it just sits there and rots under the ground. It's not going to ever do anything, is it? In a sense, that's what we do if we refuse to forgive. We just shut down, we just rot. The first key to endurance is forgiveness. So important. Now, the second key I want to talk about is being a good steward. Now, think about this. Joseph, he was sold into slavery at the age of 17. He didn't begin to rule in Egypt until he was 30. Anybody in here good at math? That was 13 years, right? He's a slave and a prisoner. That's a long time. When we read his story, we don't see him just sitting around complaining about his bad luck. It doesn't look like he's complaining, God, why did you forget me? Why did you, keep going and leave me here? We don't see him just sitting down and doing nothing. But he stewarded every opportunity that came towards him. He worked hard. He served Potiphar. He served in prison. Everywhere he was, Joseph added value. He served, and I believe God's favor was on him because of that, because he served. Because he wasn't lamenting himself, he just got to work. He didn't complain about what he did not have. Rather, he simply stewarded what he did have. And he was promoted because of his excellence in what he did. Just a short example. Years ago, when we were living in Africa, at the children's home where we're at, we had a security guard named Peter. Peter was a very nice guy, just a genuinely good guy. Had minimal education. Maybe he had an 8th grade education, I'm not sure. But Peter was just super pleasant, super hardworking, just really good with people. And Peter stood out because he was willing to do anything that you asked him to do. And so Stephanie was over the social work department at this time, and she recognized, just Peter, just who he is and the way he is with people. And she started giving him different tasks, and he did them really well. He served. He was trustworthy. He wasn't after any kind of promotion. He simply did what was asked. Now, within that social work department, we had a lot of other really qualified people who had a lot higher education. They'd been through high school. They'd had some college. They had the right credentials. But a lot of times, people like that, they're clearly after promotion. And in some ways, that actually made them less desirable. And I think, well, that's odd. Why is that? Well, because it was all about them. They wanted recognition. They weren't there to serve. They just wanted to get ahead. And so a person who serves without self-promotion is somebody that you can really trust. So like Joseph, Peter, simple guy, he could be trusted, though he had very little education and he lacked the right credentials. He actually moved up through that department, and it was because he served and just did his best in every opportunity that he was given. And so when we talk about endurance, the first key, it's forgiveness. So critical. And the second is being a good steward of what you have right now. Where has God placed you? And just do your best where you are right now. And the third thing that I want to look at this morning is relying on God. A key to endurance, really important, is learning to rely on God. Our strength is in Him. Now, I do not believe that Joseph endured simply out of his own tenacity, out of his own stick-to-itiveness. I believe he learned to rely on God. Now, if we look at him, I don't believe he could have interpreted Pharaoh's dream just on his own. None of the other wise men or magicians could have done it. I do not believe Joseph was wise enough to govern Egypt through an international crisis simply because he learned some good skills working for Potiphar. He learned maybe some things in the prison. Those things were good, but they were not the key. However, I think through those experiences, Joseph learned to rely on God. Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden that I give you is light." Now, the way in that culture they would train a young oxen to pull is they would take a young ox, not really strong, and yoke it to a full-grown, fully trained ox. Now, that young ox, it's not strong enough to pull the load, and it didn't have to. What it needed to do was learn to walk with the other ox that it's tethered to, whatever, yoked to, and not fight against it. So a key to endurance for us is learning to walk with Jesus in the direction that he's going. So how do we do that? Well, really, we need to learn to keep our eyes on him and follow him, follow his lead, which means maybe not always trying to do things in our own strength, which is really, it can be hard to learn. We love it in this culture, being self-made. I can pull myself up by my bootstraps, which is an odd picture. Like you almost have to be upside down to do that. But we love, the self-made person, and that's great, but we need to learn to rely on him. So many, many years ago, I was asked to give a 3-minute testimony in church. I will tell you, coming up with things to say has not always been my strong point, and it really still isn't. But I thought, it's only 3 minutes. Certainly I can come up with something to fill 3 minutes. And so the Saturday before, I sat down on the couch, and 3 hours went by, and I had generated a nice pile of crumpled up papers on the floor. That was it. I hadn't come up with anything. I was like, this is, ridiculous. I was frustrated. I had no idea what I was going to say. I was pulling really hard, and I was not getting anywhere. I had maybe a suggestion from somebody maybe a little wiser than myself. Told me, take a break, put on some worship music. And so I did that. I just tried to put it completely out of my head. I just put on my headphones, put on some worship music. I was just trying to focus on the lyrics, just trying to give Jesus my attention. And wouldn't you know it, all of a sudden I'd have this idea. I had this picture, and there's words with it. And literally, within the next few minutes, I had my entire talk written. I had wasted hours. I was so frustrated. Sometimes we just need to learn to rely on him, and that can be a difficult thing to learn. When my focus is on what I can accomplish, honestly, I typically struggle and I wind up getting frustrated. I'm learning to put my attention on Jesus. And what does that look like? It looks like telling him, help, I can't do this. It's funny now. It's not funny in the moment, but yes, I agree. Thank you. You know, when I do that, when I tell him, I can't do this, he helps. So endurance is not, and you've got to hear me, especially you guys, because we're terrible at this. Endurance is not, I have to work harder and I'm going to get through this. Right? Are you hearing me? That's not what endurance is. That's a surefire way to burn yourself out. Endurance is, I need to rely on Jesus and he will get me through this. Endurance is learning to walk with God and rely on him. It's not simply about, I've got to learn more skills, I got to toughen up, I got to just push through. That's how we burn out. So Joseph, he learned to rely on God. And I'm just going to run through a bunch of things real quickly. I think we see that when Potiphar, when his wife approached Joseph, he had to trust God. He was willing to risk his position in order to act in obedience. When the baker and the cupbearer, told Joseph their dreams, obviously Joseph, he had to rely on God for the interpretation. When Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams, Joseph acknowledged before Pharaoh his need for God, and then he demonstrated his dependence on God by giving the interpretation. I like this one. Joseph suggested to Pharaoh, you know what, you need to find somebody really wise to put over Egypt to store up grain. Here's what happened. This is Genesis 41, starting in verse 37. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So listen to what Pharaoh says. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court. All my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Joseph was not just a hardworking, smart guy, and Pharaoh recognized this. He recognized his reliance on God, how God had given him wisdom, and that was the reason that he put Joseph in authority over the entire nation. So the first key to endurance is anybody remember? Forgiveness, yeah. Second key, being a good steward. And third key is learning to rely on God. Our strength is in him. When Joseph was sold into slavery and then put into prison, God was not in heaven wringing his hands. Oh no, my plans are ruined. I don't know what to do. God can actually use the trials and the things that we face. He can use the setbacks. He can use those things to further his plans in our lives. Romans 8:28 says, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. But we must learn to partner with God in our trials rather than letting the enemy defeat us. None of us like trials. We don't like adversity. Honestly, somehow we think we can become an oak tree without really growing. It's like we want to win a marathon, but we want to sprint 100 yards and be done. I think we often don't realize that we need to develop endurance. We have to be able to grow in order to receive the call and the blessings that God has for us. Who wants to build a house out of this, right? It's an acorn. Now, it's going to be a tree, but it's not a tree yet. So we use wood to build houses, furniture. I don't know if we build bridges anymore, but we used to use wood for bridges. It would be silly. Nobody's going to build a house out of an acorn, right? or even a little sapling. Why? Because you need wood that has strength. You need a tree that's grown and matured, and it doesn't happen overnight. So for that tree, it's got to endure a lot of winters, a lot of storms, a lot of heat, before that acorn becomes a sapling and becomes a tree. Is this making sense? So, no matter where you are right now, doesn't matter what your situation is, if you're yoked to Jesus, you're in the right place. You might be in a difficult situation, but you're in the right place. And so the question that we should be asking ourselves is, what is Jesus doing right now? And how do I partner with him? Where I am right now. Very different than, how do I get out of this? That's what we like to ask. But the question is, if we're yoked to Jesus and he's pulling, we want to go in the direction he's going. We don't want to go in a different direction. John 16:33, Jesus said, I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world. That's pretty cool. He's overcome and we're yoked to him, right? So what we're doing is we're learning to rely on him. We're learning to go in the same direction that he's going. Romans 5 verses 3 and 4 says this, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials. Woo! For we know that we know they help us to develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. Let me read that last part again. Talking about our trials, we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. Okay, so we said faith is hope times action. So as we endure, we're growing in character and we're growing in hope of our salvation. So salvation is the Greek word sozo, which is wholeness in spirit, soul, and body. And salvation, it extends beyond just us. God's kingdom is advancing to fill the entire earth. So as we grow in endurance, we become confident of God's kingdom filling the earth. And I just want to read what was written in Hebrews about Joseph, Hebrews 11:22. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. You see, Joseph, he had endured, he had built character, and his character led him to a confident hope of salvation. He had confident hope in God's salvation. He was confident that God would lead them into the promised land. All right, we're going to wrap up here. God has such good plans for your life. We got a room full of Josephs and Josephines. We got a room full of nuts, right? We're all acorns becoming trees. That's not good. I humor myself. Question is, do we believe that? His plans are a lot bigger than ours. He wants you to be more successful in the plans that he has for you than you actually want you to be successful in those plans. And so my question is, for each of us, all right, so is there anything that's holding me back? Am I enduring? So first question we can ask ourselves, is there somebody I need to forgive? Is there anyone I'm blaming for my disappointment? Could even be myself. If we won't forgive, we won't grow. And I don't want to be a rotten little acorn because I won't forgive. Another question, am I stewarding what I've been given? Am I making the most of where I am right now? Asking Jesus, what are you doing? And then partnering with him in that. And last, am I relying on God, or am I trying to do things in my own strength? If I make it all about me, I'm not really going to get very far. And I'll admit that's a hard lesson to learn. I will never be smart enough or good enough to fulfill the plan that God has for me, because it's really not that much about what I can do. It's about what he can do. What he likes to do is promote people, and then he equips them. So we got it all backwards. We try to get better and smarter so he can promote us, and it doesn't work that way. So we've been talking about being unshakable, and being unshakable comes through endurance. And endurance is really my choice. If I can choose to forgive, if I choose to steward what I've been given, and if I choose to rely on him for his strength, we'll be unshakable. Okay, I need to pray and wrap up because some parents need to get their kids. I apologize, I'm a little bit over. Why don't you stand with me? Father, I thank you for each person in this room. And I thank you for the plans that you have for them. I thank you that you don't see us as acorns, you actually see us as the full-grown tree, and you're the one who can get us there. I bless each person who is in here to endure. I ask, Holy Spirit, that you would just overshadow them and cause them to grow. I bless each one to forgive where they need to forgive, to steward the things that you've given them, and to learn to rely on you. Holy Spirit, I thank you for each person here. We look at Joseph and we think he's so amazing, but really every person in this room is so amazing. And you've got such good plans for them. So I bless each one in Jesus' name. Amen. If I can invite the prayer team to come up. If you feel this speaking to you, I would really encourage you, come up and let somebody agree with you in prayer. And I'm not kidding when I say every person in this room, God has an amazing destiny for. I'm not joking when I say, like, Joseph was amazing, but you're literally no less amazing, and it's because of who he is and what he wants to do through you in your life. So I would encourage you, if you'd like prayer, if you need healing in your body, if you've got an issue going on, you would just like somebody to agree in prayer with you, I'd invite you to come up. If you got kids and littles, please go get them. Have a great day.